Hey friends, welcome back to another episode of the Field and Garden Podcast. It is your friend in flowers, Lisa Mason Ziegler, and I am pretty happy to be here with you today. We are pretty nippy where I am. I am sitting in front of the fire with a cup of coffee, and Tucker is asleep next to me in Steve's spot. Steve is retired now, but he's out in his shop tinkering around. So we're just kind of having a great day here. So today I want to talk about cool flowers and about planting in very early spring. And before we jump into that, I just want to remind everybody that this broadcast is brought to you by and made possible by thegardenersworkshop.com. That is where we call what we call home base. That is home to everything that we do. It's home to both of our podcasts, our library of online courses, our online garden shop where we only offer the same tools, seeds, and supplies, and my books that you hear me mention here on Field and Garden, and the stuff that I use. That's kind of our special niche, right? So when you're in the need, as well as I encourage you to sign up for our farm news, where the majority of our emails are all about pointing you to time-relevant content, y'all. We know we have tons of content, and so we're always sending out a little email saying, hey, go look at this blog, watch this video, check out this YouTube latest drop. And so sign up for our news, and all of that will be in the show notes below. But I just wanted to thank you for dropping in, and when your need arises, check out the Gardener's Workshop. But be warned, once you go over there and fall in, you will not be coming out. There is so much stuff over there for y'all. So check that out. Now, timing is so underestimated. At least I underestimated it in gardening, farming, and even in business, right? And cool flowers is no exception to that. And in fact, you could even say that their lives depend on it, right? And with one of the most versatile times to plant cool flowers coming just right around the corner for many of us, I want to remind, or perhaps even introduce you to cool flower plantings in very early spring. I just wanted to bring it up to the front seat because it's such an essential piece. But first, if you're new here to Field and Garden podcast, I want to just take a moment to welcome you here. And friends, I know that you have so many choices, and it is not lost on me that you chose to drop in here. And I just thank you for, making that conscious decision to spend some time with me. And I appreciate it. We appreciate it. And I hope it is beneficial for you too. So kind of following along that note for a moment, if you're not familiar with the term cool flowers, let me fill in the blanks. So cool flowers is the title of my first published book back in 2014. It is a how-to book on growing cool season hardy annuals using cool weather techniques. And, I didn't make up this technique or invent the concept, which is now, I just love telling y'all this, now it's affectionately referred to as the cool flower concept. I simply rekindled this awkward practice that grandmas and gardeners have used for decades, before my time and your time too, probably, right? So I didn't make this up. I just hit the old books and dug it all up, shook it off and dusted it, and here we are, right? So the basic concept is planting cool season hardy annuals into cool to cold conditions to get their best performance out of them. And that can happen during fall, winter, and or very early spring. Now, these are pretty awkward planting times, right? Which is what most of us have been led astray from for decades. It's like, Who thinks about putting little baby plants out in the garden with winter right over the horizon, or, when there might even be snow on the ground, right? So, there's a lot of great reasons why we got away from planting this most amazing group of flowers. Y'all, this is the cash crops of spring. If you're a flower farmer, you just won't even believe how this can turn your business upside down in a good way on its head. So, when to plant this group is based on where you're located. It's this, like what I like to think of as customized timing that derails so many of us. And, I will just add here, with warm season tender annuals, there's just a really quick little lesson. Most people, when they hear the word annuals, automatically think of what we've come to know as annuals, which are actually warm season tender annuals. Those are basil and tomatoes and zinnias and sunflowers and those really common annuals that grow during the summer. What most of us don't understand is they've got a sibling, and it's known as cool season hardy annuals. These are annuals that follow that same life cycle, but they're planted and usually bloom at a very different timeline than warm season annuals. And warm season is really cut and dry. You plant them after your last frost day, the soil's starting to warm up, and then they're going to grow all through the warm season, and then the first cold snap of frost comes and kills them all. End of story. Not that way with cool season hardy annuals. So that's why I call it customized. So to customize for your garden or your farm, there are 3 pieces of information that are unique to where you grow. And they lead you to learn when you should plant. And those pieces of information are your first and last historic expected frost dates, and then also your lowest winter temperature. All of that information is available online on the search engine if you don't know it. These 3 pieces of information, when you bring them together and apply them to the cool flower concept, tells you all on when to plant which cool season hardy annuals. What I mean by that is that will tell you, do you fall plant that particular flower or not? When is fall planting? When is very early spring? Those 3 pieces, when you plug them in to the equations, you're going to come out with the information that will lead you for the rest of your gardening and farming life. Confusing? Yes, at first, but as the Chinese proverb states, everything must be hard before it is easy. Y'all, it is second wind to me. I wasn't born knowing this. It's because I practiced it. So it will get easy. So to help you with this hard thing to get easier, right? I'm always dropping information bombs, I call them, across all my social channels, my YouTube channel, and here on both of our podcasts, Field and Garden, I'm doing it today, and Seed Talk, right? But if you want and need all the information in a piece of go-to all in one place, I would like to just remind you that you can check out these 2 resources that came out in 2024 that I consider essential to mastering, growing these gorgeous cool season hardy annuals. These resources were actually made based on all the questions, all the misunderstandings that we have fielded for the last 10 years since Cool Flowers. So those resources are, and then we're going to move on here. The first one is the Cut Flower Handbook, and this book will guide you step by step on not only figuring out your cool flower planting times. It actually has places to write this stuff in the book, but also how you weave warm season and cool season together, y'all, to have nonstop flowers, better known as succession planting. So that's in the Cut Flower Handbook. The other resource, which is if you're a flower farmer, I feel like this is essential to you. It's Cool Flowers, Seed to Harvest. It's our new online course that was the brainchild of Lane, and she and I did this together. Lane is my co-host for Seed Talk, and it walks you through with video demonstrations on sowing and growing and harvesting dozens of my favorite cool season hardy annuals. Beautiful imagery and videos, and friends, our courses are just like our books. You have them for life. So enough about those. The links will be in the show notes if you find that you need those. So why in the world would anybody go all this extra miles to figure out the cool flower concept? And let me just tell you in a nutshell. It's because this family of plants, when they're planted into their optimal cool conditions, are some of the most gorgeous and in-demand flowers of spring and summer. And what are we talking about? We're talking about flowers like Bells of Ireland, the most coveted flower of my 27 years of farming, the people wanting to grow it and people wanting to buy the flower. Bells of Ireland are amazing, and they're cool flower, y'all. Sweet peas, stock, Snapdragons, Lisianthus, Larkspur, Status, Poppies, and so many others. So if you want to grow these and you want to grow them well, you need to figure this out. Because when we plant during their preferred planting windows for your garden, they bloom earlier, the stems grow taller, they grow more stems, and they're more resistant to diseases and pests. Because what basically happens, friends, is when you plant them in their preferred time, that means that for those of us like me that live in the South that thought that we couldn't even grow most of these flowers because of our hot, humid summers, these flowers are ready to hit the ground running as soon as spring weather starts because we've planted them so far in advance. And that means that they're going to face heat and humidity so much longer than we ever dreamed. Y'all, I'm telling you, it'll change your gardening and farming life. So, timing with this group is what I consider to be the priceless factor. It's a factor that really cannot be overcome with any steps. There's no magic bullet. When we actually plant too late or even too early, which can be just as bad as planting too late. This family of plants in my book have become like the poster child of how great or how bad things can go based on this one simple step: when you plant them. And I tell you, friends, I talk about this in the Cut Flower Handbook a lot. It's like, we get our peas in a row and figure this mess out. You just can't believe how easy it is to grow this family, right? So let's talk about this planting window that is coming soon for many of us. Very early spring. And I'm going to go through what it is and all that stuff. But for me right now, this is in early January that I'm recording this. I am literally hitting the ground running of seed starting right now for this window. This is when we are the most hungry, right? To garden and mess around, especially to do it inside where it's cozy when it's cold outside, perhaps blowing wind like we're kind of having, or snow or whatever, right? So it's like the perfect fix for our greatest craving right now is seed starting of cool season hardy annuals for very early spring planting. So let's go, let's hit it, right? So when is very early spring? The planting window out in the garden is 6 to 8 weeks before your last expected historical frost. So there's one of those pieces of information, y'all. So for me, my historic last expected frost is mid-April. So if you count back 6 to 8 weeks, that puts me to basically Valentine's Day to March 1st. That is the optimal, most perfect planting time. No, we don't always hit it, but we try really, really hard. And what this window does when you plant, and we'll talk about this more in a moment, transplants out in the garden at that window, that 6 to 8 weeks as you're heading towards your last spring frost, weather conditions are conducive to those plants getting well established. A lot of times it can be sunnier. The temperatures can certainly we're not warm. We're still frozen here sometimes, but the weather conditions start to break a little bit. And with each little break in those weather conditions, cool flowers are getting well rooted in and prepared to put on the show. I do things here to help encourage my cool flowers that are very early spring planted to become even more well established. I do things like I automatically know that I'm going to hoop and cover with lightweight row cover, that's Ag 19, all of my cool flower plantings at this time of the year. They don't need it for cold protection, but let me just tell you something. Having that on these sunny winter afternoons and underneath that row cover, that's now your plants are not being wind whipped. The sunshine is being concentrated. It's that whole solarizing effect is happening. All of that really, really helps. So 6 to 8 weeks before your last expected historical spring frost is your planting window. I say optimal, sometimes I may be a few days later or a week earlier if weather conditions are conducive, as well as I have transplants ready, right? So who can plant in very early spring? And as a blanket answer to that, I'm going to say everybody. It doesn't really matter where you are for very early spring. Everybody. So let's just say you live way, way north. Well, you're not going to be planting in mid-February. That's because my last frost date is April 15th. If you are in Alberta or up in zone 3 or whatever, your last frost date might in fact be mid-June, right? I mean, those of us that live in the South just can't even fathom, right? So your planting date is 6 to 8 weeks before your last expected frost date. And think about when that is. And I'll tell you, since it's been 10 years since Cool Flowers has been published, and we sell more Cool Flower books, or the publisher sells more Cool Flower books every year than we did for the first few years after the book came out, because people didn't get it. Friends, people especially in the more northern, deep cold regions are learning that very early spring is their time to sing. That is their real benefit of Cool Flowers, right? So very early spring with a lot of, I talk about this in the Cut Flower Handbook. People have figured out all kinds of ways to melt snow. It's just amazing because they've seen the results of getting these plants in the ground at the proper time. So everybody, no matter where you are, can plant in very early spring. There are opposite of those people that are in really northern regions. Those of us that are in the South, we sometimes face issues with some of the flowers because historically here in Virginia, we don't even really have spring around here. We go straight from winter right into summer, meaning it goes from cold to 95-degree afternoons sometimes. So that's always been our struggle. For that kind of behavior, there are some cool flowers that really don't just have enough time in very early spring to get established. And you're really going to have to experiment and figure out what those are for you. And to have, make your own list. I'll tell you that I've learned, for me here, I'm a huge Snapdragon fan, and it's because we sold to so many florists for so many years, and that's a huge cash crop, right? So I was always looking to have as many as early and late as possible. So I used to plant snaps also in very early spring, because we plant a boatload of snaps in the fall because they just do so very, very well here. What I learned after several years of doing both is that the very early spring plantings of snaps, for me, in my conditions, while they do bloom, and I get tall enough stems usually, they're not nearly, they can't touch the performance of fall. But it was enough to make me want to plant them again. However, what I began to realize after a couple, 3 years, is that those plantings really fell victim to disease like I had never experienced on fall planted snaps, like rust. I had never had rust, and I haven't since, not planting in very early spring. It all just comes down to the conditions are conducive in that hot, humid weather for rust to happen. And the fall planted plants come on and bloom earlier, even though I get up to 8 weeks of a Snapdragon harvest from that fall planting, that the very early spring just fell victim because they bloomed later and they weren't as well established. So that's just my personal experience. You will have to find your experience out for you, right? So the other thing to know about very early spring planting is I only plant transplants at this time. And think about it. For me, it's not unusual for some snow to be on the ground. We are definitely still going below freezing here at that time of the year. Seeds, even cool season hardy annuals, need warmth to break dormancy and sprout to start growing. You can sow seeds in very early spring, but they're going to sit there and wait until warm conditions come. And by that time, you're out of the cool flower concept, right? Because those plants will be growing up and becoming established once spring is already here. So do you see that? So very early spring does not do well. You can't really do that with cool flower concept. So I am only transplanting out in very early spring, and I do go into, in the book, about some alternative ways to get those seeds that really prefer to be direct sown in the ground at that time, beyond buying plugs from a supplier to be delivered to you for on time. So the way that I kind of choose beyond falling victim to disease like I described with the snaps, stem length is the other part of this equation. I've got to have tall stems. That's just my own demand of cut flowers. And some very early spring planted cool season hardy annuals just don't get tall enough for me, again, in the South. So candidates for me when I'm trying to figure it out is those that get really tall when I fall plant them. I'm thinking of Amobium right now. Amobium gets 48 inches here when we fall plant it. So guess what? We plant it again in very early spring. So kind of size things up that way for you. So I already spoke about what I don't plant, and I'll just say again briefly, I don't direct sow, and I don't plant, again, those plants that I have trialed and experimented for in my garden that fall victim, that just aren't worth it, right? And the thing I will just, add in here is that my customers, we are seasonal outdoor flower farmers. That means we don't have any hoop houses here, right? And what I've learned after 2 decades and more of growing and selling flowers is, as seasonal as my garden is, our customers really crave it that way. They don't really want Snapdragons in July. They're looking at Lisianthus and zinnias and coxcomb and gorgeous celosia plumes, So I've learned that I don't have to push the envelope, but so hard, right? So here's the rub on very early spring planting is most of our garden spaces are too cold and wet or even frozen to be prepared for a planting at this time of the year. So we prepare all of our very early spring planting beds in the fall. Yes, like right now, I have two 75-foot long beds out in my garden that have been prepared. They're mulched with film, the biodegradable film, just ready and waiting for the plantings to come. We don't have to go out there and mess with soil. Messing and trying to prepare moist, cold soil will destroy the structure of your soil. Don't do it. Don't do it, y'all. So the timing. So if you find yourself without a place to plant, I would say one of two things. You either skip very early spring planting and get on the ball for next year, or build a raised bed as I describe it in the Cut Flower Handbook on top of the ground with purchased soil and compost that is not frozen. So check that out in there. And the last thing I want to leave you with is, do I succession plant? Yes. So for me, anything that I fall planted that I very early spring plant also, there's succession number one. And then some of the really useful in-demand flowers, I succession plant. Again, it's an experiment, y'all. I'm thinking of Buplurum and Sweet William, the Amazon series. Those are very high in-demand florist and making bouquet crops. So I succession plant those. I now also succession plant straw flowers. I succession plant Amoebium. It's whatever is useful for you in your market for your growing conditions. So friends, Cool Flowers has endless cash crop opportunities. And I just want to remind you, particularly if this is all news to you, if this concept is new to you, I want you to first start with the Cool Flower book. That's the simplest, easiest read. Get the concept down. Then you graduate to the Cut Flower Handbook, which really brings on board how you can really hone in on your planting times. And then, Cool Flowers from Seed to Harvest seals the deal, y'all. I mean, seeing it is believing it, right? And when to harvest and where to make the cuts, as well as the seed starting and growing tips and troubleshooting. Baby steps, y'all. Remember, if you plant later than recommended, you will likely not experience the benefits of the Cool Flower concept. I say this because the number one thing that surfaces when I'm troubleshooting with my students in the club or what have you, what comes out based on the problem that they're experiencing and what they share is that they did not plant on time for their conditions. And I just say that, I almost feel like if you're going to be late, save it till the next planting window. And as you'll learn, if you're just learning about this, there are other planting windows. You just have to find when yours are. So friends, thanks for hanging with me. Can't wait to hit this year running with you. This year, our club community, the Flower Farmer Club, is really getting rich, y'all. I cannot wait to see you over there if you're in my membership. And you can learn more about all of that. The links are in the show notes. And friends, I'm going to finish off my coffee, put on some long johns, and go out and peek under the covers of my Cool Flower garden that was planted in the fall and start some seeds indoors and warm back up for my very early spring Cool Flower planting. All right, friends, until we meet again, ciao.